Creator. Okay, and we're live. I'm going to switch to gallery view because I actually think that that's better because everyone can see both of us at both times and our reactions and that kind of thing. So
I have to behave myself. Got it.
yes, exactly. So Tripp here. This is a conversation on St. Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher and theologian. The purpose of the video is Sam on our channel has started an open letter with me on divine simplicity and the Trinity. And so I will be going a lot into Aquinas in the future in terms of responding to that and arguing some of these things about divine simplicity and what that is in the Trinity. And Eric is actually gonna kind of co-write that response with me. But before that, just for the people who might be interested in these topics, we wanted to do kind of a primer video, or at least like a setting of Thomas Aquinas, who he was, why is he important? Like, why do I, a Protestant living in Seattle, care what Thomas Aquinas says and his philosophical and theological system? What were his influences? What were some of the, and just set the stage for why we think it's important to talk about these things in what we'll call Thomistic terms. So, Eric, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Deacon Eric Seitz. I've been studying to be a Catholic priest since 2011, and I'm finally getting very close. I'm a transitional deacon, and I will be ordained to the Catholic priesthood on August 8th in Fargo, North Dakota. While I was in seminary, I really enjoyed the intellectual formation I was given, especially liked any time that we got to bring Thomas Aquinas into this, and I just kind of stumbled across this Discord thing via Paul Vanderklay, and I've just kind of put my 2 cents in whenever I thought I could, and now I'm making this video with Mr. Tripp. So
yeah, sounds good. And how did you find Paul Vanderklay on YouTube or Twitter or how? Okay,
YouTube via his Jordan Peterson video, like everybody else.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you're a Peterson fan then?
I'm an admirer, fan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, so the format of this, Eric and I was talking about it. I will mainly be the question asker here, just because he's actually been training in this, and we'll see where it goes. Obviously, for those who have seen any videos of mine, I'm an opinionated person, so I will have thoughts as well. But it'll be primarily that. So, could you just walk us through Thomas Aquinas? Who was he? Where did he come from? Like, why is he important? Why are we talking about him? Why are we in 2020 doing a video about this guy and why we think he's important?
Right. So Thomas Aquinas, born circa 1225 in Italy, in the Kingdom of Sicily, came from a noble family. And so obviously we're looking at 13th century Italy. We're thinking this is really Catholic country, right? I mean, 312, the Edict of Constantine, you had the Papal States, you had, perhaps the peak of medieval Catholic culture at this time. And so he's born into that. And I think G.K. Chesterton put this well in, I can't remember if it was his history of Thomas, or his biography of Thomas Aquinas, or his biography of St. Francis, but Catholicism had been around long enough to become old at that point. He was farther separated from Christ than we are from. It'd be about Augustine than what would, like, Chaucer? I don't know. Like, think that far back.
Right.
That's about how far things were. He started his training as a theologian very early with the Benedictines. He went to a Benedictine school at that time, and always had that interest in theology. There's a story of him being like 4 years old and asking his nurse, "What is God?" So that was just kind of the level he was operating at.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his family was going to set him up as the abbot of Monte Cassino, the big Benedictine monastery there, and that would have just been a perfect, semi-political appointment. But yeah, he's a good kid; he'll make a good monk. And he went off and joined the Dominicans. They looked like a venerable order to us at the time, but they were brand new. There was some
Hmm.
Spaniard who was preaching against Albigensians who was forming this order. They didn't own um, property the same way that the Benedictines did. They were a mendicant order, so they relied on alms of other people to fund their mission. And their family actually opposed this. And so the story goes, it's a little fuzzy in the details, but his family locked him up on the top of a tower to try and convince him to change his mind.
Right.
Um, and he just sat there patiently, waited his family out, and then eventually got to go join the Dominicans. And ended up, I think, teaching at the University of Paris.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was
Yep.
his kind of, but he did most of his education in Naples.
Yep. Why was he called the dumb ox?
Oh, so there's this. He was a very quiet man to begin with. He didn't, perhaps spend as much time socializing as his other students, and he didn't speak up much during class. But his teacher, Saint Albert the Great, also a theologian of some renown. Um, People were talking about this, Thomas Aquino kid, and he was like, someday that dumb ox is going to roar. He was also a very, so that's dumb right there. And then he was also just a very large man.
Yeah.
People debate as to whether he was fat or whether he was just built big, and it
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
you have the stories of Aquinas with him cutting like a circle out of the table so that he could sit in it because he was
Hmm.
fat. I don't know if that was
Yeah.
apocryphal or whatever, but
I don't think anybody took his dimensions, and it doesn't
no,
really
I don't
matter
either.
because
Yeah.
even if he was just big in the shoulders and had a little extra weight on him, he just kind of made that impression that he was bigger than average when he was
Mhm.
coming down the street at you.
Gotcha.
So hence the dumb ox.
So how did he become such a large influence on Catholic theology? Like, how did
Well,
that
see,
come about?
it's really funny how that came about. So every religious order at that time wanted to have their own kind of teaching, right? And so you'd have, the Franciscans, they had Bonaventure, or they had, so you had Bonaventurists, or you had Scotists, or you had Alchemists, and then, the Augustine hermits, they would have their own theologians and stuff. And so Thomas Aquinas's influence was really kind of only in the Dominican order for sort of centuries after um, after his writings, and so you don't see him immediately having that much of an impact, right? It's like he got drowned out by kind of all the theological noise in the universities in Europe at this time. It was Cardinal Cajetan, famous for his encounter with Luther in the 16th century, who wrote the first major commentary on the Summa Theologiae, and who started using Thomas Aquinas as a primary textbook. But immediately after that happens, what happens is the Protestant Reformation. And so you've got the Counter Reformation going against that. And it's sort of all hands on deck on that. And then you jump straight from that into the modern period. So all of a sudden, the universities are all focused on Descartes, they're focused on Spinoza, Hobbes, Hume's, that whole modern project. So it really isn't until the 19th century that in Catholic thought, Thomas Aquinas really starts gaining traction outside of the Dominican order. And there was a very influential priest, I can't remember his name now, but he was hugely influential during the 19th century as sort of a revival of Thomas Aquinas, and he helped draft a lot of the Vatican I documents, which you can see a lot of Thomistic thought in there. By the time of the Leo the 13th, he was the Pope at the end of the 19th century, and he made a law that seminarians should be taught the theology of Thomas Aquinas. And if you wanted to say on one issue or another, later disagree or have your own take or your own interpretation, it's not like that was strictly forbidden, but
Right.
he wanted Thomas Aquinas to be held up as the theologian of the church, precisely because, this is kind of my take on that, is his method as being the most Catholic method. Maybe you don't have to follow every single conclusion he ever had. Certainly Pius IX didn't when he declared the Immaculate Conception a dogma. And you can find places where Thomas Aquinas says that Mary was not conceived without sin. So we don't have to be slavish disciples of him, but there's something about the way that he's thinking, which is uniquely Catholic, in which if that can get embedded in a seminary and in his formation, will not only make him a better theologian, but a better pastor and a better preacher and all the things that go along with that.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, so let's hover there for a little bit. He's called, a doctor, of the, kind of, what is it? A doctor of the Catholic?
Doctor of the Church.
Doctor of the Church. Yeah. So what does that mean?
Yeah. So doctor is just the medieval teacher for, medieval word, Latin word for teacher. So, when you go to your doctor, it might be more accurate to say you're going to see a physician. So we still have PhDs. That's a doctorate in philosophy. So it's just teacher. The Catholic Church will hold up certain individuals' teaching as of universal importance, right? So basically, every saint that we have writings on, they have teachings, right? But the church recognizes that some saints have teaching that needs to go beyond just their time, their place. So one of my favorite saints, Saint John Vianney, we have some of his sermons recorded. They're very French. They're very 19th century. And what he would say made a lot of sense in France, the 19th century.
Yep.
But his specific teaching in his homilies is not like something that everybody needs to study, but when you get to St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, you get St. Alphonsus, you get St. Albert the Great, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, it's like, okay, these guys, they contributed something which moved the football forward for the whole church.
Gotcha.
Not just this time, this place.
Right. So he's a teacher of the church that we feel like, that the Catholic Church feels like stands the test of time and has something kind of more universal, more eternal, if we want to use that term, to say about things than even your average, your average priest or Christian who might say something that is helpful or useful or even correct. This person is doing something that's different, that's more broad, kind of like not to this extent, but like a parable of Jesus or something like that. That's got like this kind of like this longer term application that can happen. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned like one of the reasons that you think that he meets that criteria is his methodology, like the way that he goes about things and why it's so important that everyone in the Catholic order needs to study his theology. Can you talk about that? What is his methodology? The scholastic method, like what is this?
Okay, scholasticism can be defined as a project with two goals. One is to organize Catholic beliefs in a systematic way, and the other one is to offer rationalization not rationalization, but rational arguments in defense of Catholic faith. And I think the reason that Thomas Aquinas is sort of a model for this is the way he's able to balance faith and reason and show the harmony between those two. He really took, I think it's, where's his name? Augustine, and in his tradition we have the ontological argument. Anselm really took his dictum, I believe, in order that I may understand it, he just sort of embodied that in a very consistent way. And so that's why I think a very useful way to understand Thomas Aquinas is to just look at who he's citing when he can. So if you read through something like the Summa Theologiae, you just got to get the basic structure of his arguments. He'll steel man his opponent first in his objections, and then he'll offer sort of an authoritative word to support his own position. Then he'll offer his arguments for the position, and then he'll offer the reply to those objections at the front. If you look at that authoritative section, whenever he can get a scriptural citation, he'll always go for a scriptural citation. So there's this one article, I can't remember exactly where this was, but he was talking about whether or not God has ordered the universe well, right? It's like, okay, well, I guess we have to ask that question. And he took a quote from the Book of Wisdom, which was, "You have numbered all, you have measured all things according to number, measure, and weight," something like that. And it's from Jerome's Vulgate, obviously. It's just like, yeah, when he wants to say something, when he wants to demonstrate something and argue something, his first authority he's always going to go for is that argument from faith, from Scripture. And so he really, some people will accuse him of being rationalist because of the degree to which he employs philosophy in his argumentation. And while I certainly think there are plenty of scholastics who fell into that rationalization trap, especially the farther and farther you get from the beginning of the scholastic project in about the 9th, 10th century, once you get into like the 14th, 15th, 16th century, I think theologians start getting a little too impressed with their own logic, and they really start to lose that grounding in Scripture. And a lot of people,
I would say, like, that's one of the things that's always struck me about Aquinas is that, like, sometimes he, it's kind of like 3 categories. So he's always going to use the scholastic method, and so some things he'll say, listen, I can't logically prove this. I can't rationally prove this. So the Trinity would be one such thing, right? He can't. He's like, I have no like natural theology that would give me this, right? This is part of theology proper, right? The study of God versus natural theology of what we know about God from what He's created. And so he says, like, I can't get from natural theology to something like the Trinity. I rely on Scripture. That's a revelation, right? And he was totally comfortable with that. It's not like he was saying, like, so what he would say about the Trinity is trying to prove that it's not illogical, that it's not irrational, that it works, but it has to be revealed. It's not something that I can prove, like, I can prove God's existence in some aspects of God. That's one that I can't prove. There are other ones that he says, well, both Scripture reveals it and I can prove it. And there's some things that Scripture doesn't reveal, but I can also prove, right? Rationally, I can approach that. And in some ways, it's a very humble way of approaching these problems, right? Is like to categorize them and say, well, listen, I can know more than what Scripture says, but I can't prove everything Scripture says rationally. And so I think that's where the rationalists went too far, and they're like, well, if it's in Scripture, I need to be able to prove it rationally absent revelation. And Thomas Aquinas does not go there. That is very clearly not what he believed.
Right, and so that's just sort of a result of believing in one God as the author of all truth.
Right.
And just having that firmly convicted inside your bones so much that it's like, well, of course there's not going to be a contradiction between Scripture and science.
Right.
Why is that even a concern for you?
Exactly. So like his task a lot of times was to try and say, listen, there's a mystery, but there's not a contradiction, right? And kind of the way that I would sum up Thomas Aquinas's philosophy would be just that. Like, good philosophy doesn't reduce the mystery of God. Like, it doesn't try to eliminate the mystery of God. Good philosophy gets reduced to the mystery of God. And like Aquinas really goes there. Like, he's like, listen, I'm sure it's not contradictory, but it is a mystery. And he's totally comfortable sitting in that. It's a mystery. which is what I appreciate about them. And I don't like the reductive nature of the rationalists, nor do I like the mysticism of saying we can't know some things and like it doesn't matter, ignore contradictions and that kind of stuff. Aquinas is trying to straddle that fence, which I appreciate.
Yep.
So what were his major, you mentioned, scripture as being the top one. What are some of the other like systems of philosophy or people that were really big influences on Aquinas?
Right, right. Well, just one last thing about scripture. He wrote a ton of scriptural commentaries.
Yeah.
I remember reading, I can't remember what source it was, but they said that nobody had written a treatise on Paul between Paul's letter to the Romans between like Augustine and Calvin or something. I don't know who was saying that, but
Who
it's
said
like,
that? Yeah, no.
like, and so obviously it wasn't anybody that we're friends with,
Well, that's the
because
thing.
they
That's
wouldn't say
another
that.
thing is I think that people don't understand how much he wrote either. I think that everyone's kind of like they're familiar that he wrote the Summa, kind of,
Hmm.
and that kind of thing. But we don't realize that the Summa was like a primer for a larger philosophical system that he wrote extensively about, and he wrote commentaries on the Bible using that system. And
Hmm.
it's within the context of that, then you read the Summa and it makes sense. But if you just like the Summa is just kind of like a primer, it's like here's some basics, but it
Right,
goes
because
way deeper than that.
right, because the Summa is a genre, right?
Right,
It's a genre wherein you cover everything contained within a single science, every topic. So, lots of people had Summas of theology.
right.
His is just the only one we remember because it's the best.
It's the best. Yes.
It's the best.
Yep.
Well, and then just before we get more into the sources, you know, I think the real genius of Thomas Aquinas comes from his ability to synthesize rather than to have bold new insights on his own. So I
Yeah.
think if you'd had a fellow like Thomas Aquinas in the first centuries of Christianity, he wouldn't have made near as much an impact because there was just less of those. I don't want to say original, but I'm going to say original thinkers, right? Like, Saint Augustine just has this ability to take like a leap forward, and that's
Yeah.
why he's so important. And the reason why I think Saint Thomas Aquinas is such a powerful theologian is because he was able to understand what other people were writing and to be able to sew it together into a coherent whole. And so that's why it's so fascinating to even just take a look at his influences, his major influences. And certainly we put scripture at the top, and then the papal magisterium wasn't quite as codified at this time as it is in our modern time. So he will cite papal bulls on occasion, but they don't play quite the same role as they do in Catholic theology today,
Right.
which I find very interesting, and maybe is another conversation for another time.
That would be
Um,
interesting.
yeah. So I think after Scripture, Saint Augustine's biggest contributor is Saint Thomas Aquinas' biggest contributor is Augustine. Flip my A's around there. He frequently is citing the De Trinitate, the De Civitate Deis, De Doctrina Christianae. So all of his sort of major works, his commentary on the Psalms, which I think is probably underappreciated, but that's a huge source of theology for Thomas Aquinas, is his commentary on the Psalms. It's a huge source of that theology for Augustine too. Like that was, to do commentary on all 150 Psalms, like that's quite the undertaking. And it's got sort of doctrinal meditations in addition to, what we say, spiritual meditations. They're not, spirituality and theology weren't distinct
Right.
disciplines at that time. And so that gets a lot of Neoplatonic thought built into St. Thomas Aquinas's thinking, right? The notion of participation is so present in St. Thomas Aquinas's thought that you can't even find it. It's just built into the structure of
Yeah.
of the way he thinks and the way he speaks. And so I've got a an example here. I think I can get there pretty quickly. Right. So we're just going to go into the three modes of God's presence in creation. Right. He's got he's present by power. He's present by his knowledge, and he's present by his conservation in of all things in their continued existence. And further, rational souls have the possibility of participation by grace, and for the soul of Christ himself, participation by the hypostatic union. And so just, the fact that he would even ask that question, how can God be present in all these ways, and then give such a thorough answer, is just sort of like a revelation of how thoroughly he was present. That, even, government's knowledge and essence, what was that? Conservation, that in itself has got participation built straight into the notion of creation, and that how all creation naturally reflects its creator in there. And that also ties in with his notion of the analogy of being, and well, how can we use an analogous mode of predication to speak about God? Because all effects resemble their causes. And since we are an effect of God's creation, we can talk about him as our cause and the effect being reflected in the cause. So it's just like drilled into the structure of that. So yeah, you get Augustine, and also you certainly get Dionysius, sometimes called Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, since it probably wasn't actually the guy mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. It was probably a 5th century monk. Both of those being heavily Neoplatonic philosophers. And then
Boethius
being
too.
able to...
Boethius too would also be like
Boethius,
Boethius would be a Neoplatonic philosopher as well. So yeah.
And so all of that just getting kind of baked into the structure of his thought, while at the same time being able to avoid the potential pitfalls of Neoplatonism, right? So that, somebody like Plotinus would say that creation emanates necessarily from God. And not only as a good Christian does Thomas Aquinas preserve the freedom of God in his creation, but also shows how that's less in keeping with Scripture and the tradition, and is a distortion of Neoplatonic thought. Then so anyway, it all just comes together. All just comes together well.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I mean, you mentioned earlier, like, you don't know that he would have had, you don't think that he could have had the kind of influence that he did if he had come, say, in the first, 500 years or something, especially pre-Augustine. There's another big citation that he makes, and that would be Aristotle, and certainly, a Western, Catholic monk would not have had access to Aristotle's writings had he come too early, because they were lost, and it wasn't until Averroes and Maimonides, and then they eventually make their way back into the West. And obviously, let's talk about Aristotle a little bit, because that's another like gigantic way that the system of thought is so influenced by that, and that's how he marries the Neoplatonic thought with like the Christian scripture, right? Because you need a bridge there, because Platonism doesn't work on its own, and Neoplatonism doesn't work if you're also holding the scripture up. So let's talk. Can you talk a little bit about Aristotle and how that?
Yeah, I just one little thing there. I think Dionysius and Augustine did a lot of that synthesizing work already, of taking those Neoplatonic insights into the Christian tradition and then filtering out, kind of the more problematic aspects. But yeah, Aristotle. So what was the big deal about Aristotle? Well, Aristotle, as you said, had been, he hadn't been utterly forgotten in the West. Like, they remembered that there was this student Aristotle, but a lot of his original writings have been forgotten. And moreover, when they started to become reintroduced into the West, into the university systems, it was a Latin translation of Averroes' Arabic commentary on Aristotle's Greek.
Right.
So, so first off, it's coming from an Islamic philosopher, right? Christendom and Islam weren't exactly on the best terms at that time, so
Right.
it was automatically regarded with the hermeneutic of suspicion, not to be helped by what was it, Avicenna, who had the concept of the universal intellect,
Right.
so that individually humans would have a passive intellect, but the active intellect is all one in us. I was like, well, okay, like, how are we going to get to square that with the Judeo-Christian tradition? It doesn't really happen. And so there was just this immediate tension in the university systems in the Christian West about, well, how do we regard Aristotle now? How do we regard Aristotle? And you could see kind of extreme reactions. Some people saying, no Aristotle, we just kick him out.
Right.
We have Augustine, why do we need him? Other people, like I think it was Siger of Brabant, started advocating for things like the universal active intellect. Was got him in trouble with the church authorities, got Thomas Aquinas attacking him. No little controversy surrounding him. And it was sort of this successful integration into this Christian Neoplatonic tradition that, Albert the Great, he did a lot of work with that. He was Thomas Aquinas's teacher and huge influence on him, which is sometimes not appreciated as much as it could have been. So Albert the Great was involved in this discussion too. And so his ability to, and then there's Aristotelian doctrines, which were also problematic, like the eternity of the world,
Right.
which seems to contradict creation ex nihilo. And Thomas Aquinas was just sort of the masterful, take these aspects of Aristotle's thought and find their real value, in the formal and material, right? So the formal cause and the material cause and the four causes, that goes beyond just, physics and how objects exist and the hylomorphic union, all that. That becomes sort of a transcendent category to the point where Aquinas talks about in the Secunda Secundae how charity becomes the form of all virtues. And it's like, well, okay, is it literally like a hylomorphic composition of this form and matter inside the human soul? Like, no. But it's just that concept can become bigger than even what Aristotle had it as, having a formal principle of something rather than just strictly a formal principle in a material object.
Right.
And all sorts of brilliant syntheses along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, the eternality of the world is, I think, one of those areas that kind of like the Trinity, where Aquinas, I think, and even other Christians, earlier Christians, like I think Origen might have thought that the world might be eternal as well. And so like this was clearly Aristotle thought that. And this is one of those areas though where Aquinas basically went with like kind of the Trinity model, saying I can't prove that that's impossible, right? So Aquinas would actually disagree with like William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological arguments and that kind of thing. Like he would say, no, actually it is possible that the world has existed forever. His version of that kind of causation from God is a vertical one, not a horizontal one. So it's not like the dominoes falling and causing each one in time. It's not a time-based argument or even like a sequential cause like horizontally. It's more like top down, like what's holding this whole thing up causation. That's his version of the cosmological argument. And so like he would actually really disagree with William Lane Craig and the people that would like kind of misrepresent or use a different version of the cosmological argument.
And also Bonaventure
And
would say
Bonaventure,
that you could prove that the
yeah.
world was
And
created
so,
in time.
whatever but it is interesting that like that is one of the other areas where Aquinas, like I can't rationally prove it, but clearly scripture teaches that creation happened at a moment in time, right? And so he defers to that and says that's not contradictory with anything else that I'm arguing, or the rational system, but I can't rationally build that case because I don't think it's true. So it's a type of intellectual honesty that I really appreciate in Aquinas too, that he's not trying to, he will not claim to be able to prove something that he can't prove, which I think a lot of times goes, we don't do that a lot, right? A lot of times it's the rationalist like imperative, right? We have to logically prove everything from the bottom up. And Aquinas is like, nope, can't do that. That's not possible. But that's fine because we have revelation and it's consistent with everything else that we know. So
right.
Anyway,
another major influence that I think a lot of people miss is Saint Gregory the Great and his commentary on Job, his moral commentary on Job. That's all over the place, especially when you get into Thomas Aquinas's treatises on human nature.
Yeah.
Like the whole notion of, like the system of virtues that he lays out. We've got the 4 cardinal virtues, and you can annex other virtues underneath that. And then you've got like the daughters of this virtue and the daughters of this vice, and all that. A ton of that comes from Saint Gregory the Great's moral commentary on Job. I don't even know if that one's been translated into English recently.
I don't know either. I've never read it. I've seen people. I know in reading commentaries of Aquinas, they mention how much of an influence that is, but I've never actually read that. I know, like I think Gilson in his his books on Aquinas, he talks about the influence, but I've never actually read it. I don't even. Yeah, it's one of those things that like it's referenced, but never actually cited in some ways, which is interesting. I don't know. Have you read it at all?
No, I haven't, I haven't looked that hard. And then the only copy I ever found in the library was the Latin original. And, I've got decent Latin, but no, not unless you put me in a university to study this.
Yep. I do think that's an interesting thing that like Aquinas did also come at a very interesting time when like a lot of these translations were like, obviously he knew Latin very well, but you also you were starting to have better translations of Greek also into Latin, which really helped because that is one of the things. Like Augustine was brilliant and had all these new ways of looking at things. But if you read Augustine, often he'll even say like, my Greek's not that good. I don't really know what these people are talking about. And so like maybe they have a point. I don't know. Like, I mean, he'll literally say that sometimes, but Aquinas came at a time where that wasn't really necessary because you were starting to have better translations of some of the Greek, not just the scriptures, but things like Aristotle and all these other Greek thinkers, Boethius and that kind of thing, that Augustine just wasn't privy to, and did not himself speak Greek. I mean, he read Greek, but did not himself, read it well enough to really understand the systems of thought in ways that I think Aquinas could, which is why I think Aquinas was so good at synthesizing them, and why he was so good at that, because he had access to lots of information that previous people did not. And it's one of those, like, God placed him right place, right time for him to do what he does best, which is synthesize, I think. Anyway, so any other influences that you can think of?
Those are the big ones. He's really good at handling disputes between the church fathers too, where he'll say, well, Ambrose said this and Jerome said that, and well, I go with Jerome here for X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so you'll get arguments between the church fathers resolved in him. think you'll get a lot of distortions in Augustine. So sometimes, one of his objections will be something Augustine says, and then a misinterpretation underneath it, and he'll go ahead and clear it out. So just being able to understand Augustine well was
Yeah.
just like a huge step forward that saved him a whole bunch of problems. So yeah, that's, those are your big ones: Scripture, Augustine, Dionysius, St. Gregory the Great, Aristotle, and the other church fathers. Whenever he can make an argument using them as his authority, he will.
Yeah.
And it's only in those places where he can't be firmly grounded in that he'll have to make his own arguments, basically.
Yeah. So those are his influences. What do you think what are a couple of like key concepts or terms that Aquinas would use, or like a Thomist like you or me might use, that might get misinterpreted? Like, what are the key like things that you need to understand about the Thomistic system in order to properly either critique it or defend it?
Oh, I don't have a quick answer for that. Yeah, I think
I'll give one that I find is that
mm-hmm.
the doctrine of analogy, right? That is a really important one with him,
Mm-hmm.
and it's where the rationalists, that they have a very different interpretation, or a very different way of like viewing epistemology and knowledge and all of this kind of stuff. That
Mm-hmm.
the difference between God and us is so great that we know by analogy what God is like, but we don't have univocal knowledge of God.
Mm-hmm.
And God's knowledge is univocal, and this is very different than I think that most people, and our knowledge, not even of God, but just our knowledge in general, we know by analogy, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it's not true knowledge, it's not equivocal knowledge, but it's analogous.
Right.
And so when we talk about God being the Father and the Son and these kind of things, like, we're using analogies because we have to. So it's necessary in our everyday life just to know things, but it's really necessary for God. And so, if like, one of the mistakes I think people often make is they try and use like what we see things happening like here with like me and you and whatever, and then we reason up to God and say God's exactly like that, right? As opposed to the other way around, saying, well, no, we're participating, analogously in what is God's like, but it's never the same as what God is. And so God's knowledge of himself, logos, is very different than my knowledge of myself, right? And especially the univocal knowledge of a being who is pure being is like, now we're talking about something very different, and you can't apply human categories to God in that way, and strictly apply them in a rationalist sense. So I think analogy is one of the key concepts that you have to get about Aquinas, especially when he's talking about his theology proper. What is God like? It's really important. So that's one that I think is an important concept that we've lost in some way.
Especially because he points out different types of analogies and say this one works and these don't.
Right. Yep.
And then it's all contained in a question called the names of God, which, if you're looking to study analogy, might not be the first place you'd go looking.
Yeah, and this like, some names can be applied to all the persons of the Trinity, and some are properly applied to one person of the Trinity. And so, like, again, like, it's a really important concept, and it kind of just like percolates throughout his theology. So that's one for me. You think of any? I can think of, causation is one.
Yeah, the difference between event causation and ontological causation, and the difference between those notions. That's huge, because in a Thomistic system and an Aristotelian system, and probably for most of the ancients, their notion of causality was primarily objective, right? So they would think of it, if they were thinking thoroughly, as reality being communicated between different objects, right? And there was some perfection that this object was giving to this object, or this, you know, they would think of it all out there. Whereas if you start looking at David Hume, his, at least his method for approaching causality is sort of inside out, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, look, we can't observe reality at its core causing things. So all we can do is make mental associations.
Yeah. We infer causation. We don't observe it. Yeah.
Right. And Aquinas would be like, well, okay, but like, okay, I get it. All knowledge begins in the senses, but it's obviously there, you know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
your entire project is wrong.
Yeah, right. And also, we should point out also that another thing that I'm constantly pushing back on is the idea that just because we have a material kind of Humean description of a causal event doesn't mean that it doesn't prove that there's not like a teleological or final cause, or there's not a formal cause and those kind of things. And in fact, Aquinas or Aristotle would say, well, I would expect there to be a material and efficient cause. Those are always present. So you giving me the material and efficient causes and saying, listen, I can even describe them mathematically, in no way undermines, like they would say, actually, I'm wrong if you can't do that. And so you're not actually answering, you're not actually objecting in a way that's outside, and it's a misunderstanding of the system to think, oh, so now that I can describe gravity, there's no telos to the rock falling or something like that. And that's something that I even see really good philosophers, I won't name names, but people who have seen the videos probably know what I'm talking about. Like people who have PhDs and teachers and professors at universities make that argument. Be like, well, this removed telos from the world. You're like, no, it didn't. Not for Aristotle and Aquinas. That would actually be very much expected, what you're saying. And that's why other men like Kepler very much still believed in, like, no, I'm actually thinking the thoughts of God after him whenever I describe these things mathematically. It's not as if like, oh, I'm reducing and I'm removing meaning or telos from the world or anything else like that. So that teleological causation and that kind of stuff is another area that I think that people, like, our modern conception is very different than what they had, and ours is reductive, but I don't think it's necessary, and it's certainly not a reply to them. It's not an objection that they would find troubling. They would look at you and be like, well, yeah, of course, like, good for you, you're good at math. That doesn't take away the ontological causation that I'm talking about.
And then it's also kind of a reduced notion of what event causality or what causality is because, you know, if you go deep enough into the Aristotelian rabbit hole, you'll find out that efficient causality and final causality are almost two sides of the same coin,
Right?
Because every efficient cause is operating towards a specified end,
Right?
And
Yeah.
that's not even like a scientific question right there. That's like so embedded in the scientific worldview that they can't even see it anymore.
Right.
That you could separate it out anyway.
Right. Well, and similarly, the like material and formal cause are almost like two sides of the same coin as well, because like prime matter is just chaos, right? It's not anything in itself. It's not intelligible. It's not. It's just so like you always have the material and the like those are also two sides of the same coin. So it can become, I think Aquinas did a really nice job of kind of like melding them together and saying these are all present and you're not getting rid of them. So that's one. I don't know, potency and act, I think are interesting concepts that we've kind of lost. I don't know if you find that people don't really understand what we mean by like potency and act.
Right. Well, yeah. What about potency and act? So those are sort of more general categories for Aquinas, that potency and act aren't actually their own binary, but they describe a lot of other binaries. So like form and matter. Well, form is the active principle and matter is the passive principle, essence and existence. Well, form, the essence is the formal principle and existence is the material principle. soul and body. Uh, the soul is the active principle, and the body is the potent principle. Getting a little mixed up here. Yeah, and you know, when I was first learning these things, I was like, okay, well, what does prime matter? You know, just unconsciously, I'm a
Right.
19-year-old. I've never studied any philosophy before. I was like, okay, what's prime matter like? And I just sit there and I start trying to think about what prime matter is like. And it's like, a few years after that exercise, it was like, no, the prime matter doesn't actually exist. It's
Nope.
a substrate on which other forms impose their reality on.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the earth was formless, right?
yeah.
And the spirit of God was hovering over the waters, which represent chaos, right? It's not something in itself. It's you can't describe it because you can't. How can you know it if it has no form? You're informed by the what it is, and there's
Mhm,
nothing there. So prime
mhm,
matter is, yeah, it's the substrate, it's the chaotic substrate, and so we
mhm.
can think about it abstractly, but you can't. We can describe, I guess it's one of those things where we can describe what it's not, but you can't
Mhm.
describe what it is really. Like
Because
it's not anything.
yeah, it's not
Yeah,
anything. What
yeah,
is prime matter?
yeah.
It's a theory. It's a
Right,
being of reason.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's a being of
uh,
reason. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Any other major topics that you wanted to chat about the primer of Aquinas? I know that you and I are working on, kind of um, to try and see if we can explain why we don't think that the Trinity and divine simplicity are actually contradictory. Any interesting, any important thing that you want to kind of prime that discussion?
Hmm. Oh, to prime that discussion.
Yeah, any concepts or anything like that that you think would be helpful?
I mean, I think we're going to dive into the concept of relation as an accident,
Hmm.
and I think we're going to spend a lot of time there. Just something I think is very important to know about St. Thomas Aquinas isn't just the fact that he was really, really, really smart. Um, that he's also a saint, that he was also a man of discipline. He was a man of extraordinary charity to everyone around him. Um, and there's a little evidence of that was how much time he would spend writing letters to people. All sorts of people would write him letters, and whenever he could, he would write them back. And even if they were sort of, you know, like not very intelligent letters, he'd always give them a thoughtful response. And
Hmm.
that's not something that somebody who's too big for their britches is going to do. They're just going to throw the fan mail out. Um, and really, he was quite the mystic too. We get all these stories about, and I think they're true stories of, the crucifix speaking to Thomas,
Hmm.
um, and that vision of whatever he had, where he declared all his writings were straw, and the idea that it's not like, you could think of, a lot of people would think of holiness as immediately meaning being boring. Um, which is just an absolute caricature, and then B as sort of being contradictory with intelligence, right? Because our sort of model for intelligence in the modern West is the skeptic, the
Hmm.
questioner, sort of the rebel who's so smart that he can see through the lies.
Right.
Um, and it's hard for us as 21st century people to see the faithful man as being an icon of the intellectual life. But that's really what Thomas Aquinas was able to bring together was, what you could say a simple faith with a very subtle mind, and being able to parse things out precisely. Um, and that there was really something, his experience of being a Christian, his experience of receiving the sacraments, of celebrating Mass himself, of chanting the Psalms in choir with his other Dominicans. It's all of this very his very experience of Christ's redeeming power in his life as being what took him from just being an above average logician, like say Peter of Abelard or Peter the Lombard, neither of whom would be canonized saints, but made important contributions to theology, really gave it that the soul of his theology, really the form of his theology was all bound up in his love of God and love of neighbor. And how when he says that, the Christian perfection consists in love of God and love of neighbor, it's not just an idea for him. It was something he was able to consistently live out throughout the entirety of his life. And that's what gives him in his Summa and all his scripture commentaries that ineffable way of speaking that's just captivating. And I think that's what keeps on calling people deeper and deeper into Thomas Aquinas, is just, the man and the writings are just consistent. It's all love of God, love of neighbor, when you get down to the bottom of it.
Yeah. So Luke on the Discord often, he just had a chat with Paul, and so he was laying out his, propositional knowledge is potential knowledge, is the way that he described it. And I don't know if I would, I'm trying to think of a better word than potential knowledge, because it makes it seem like it's fake or something like that. So I think that it's like, I think that word like is connoting something that I don't think Luke is intending. But I do think that there is a certain truth to the fact that living out the thing, like the propositional knowledge, is a type of knowledge in itself that can't just be, it's deeper than, like, it takes on a new life. Like if Jesus just said the things that he said but didn't do the things that he did, would we think of him the same way, right? So it's both, and that's the thing. I agree, and to me at least, I mean, I'm a stan, so that's fine. But to me, even reading Aquinas, you get that feeling that this is not someone, like he will just completely nuke some arguments and that kind of stuff, but you never, you always get the feeling that he's the original guy who straw manned, right? That was what steel man arguments, right? He was trying to faithfully represent what people were saying and point out where things were right and wrong, but he never used excessive force in doing it. He would always like, you could tell that he knew that there were people on the other end of this, and honestly, in ways that Augustine sometimes didn't. Like Augustine was a bishop. Yeah,
he had to keep people in line.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes Augustine was, I feel like, harsher than maybe he should have been or could have been. But then again, he's in a different time where you kind of need some nuke some heretics, I guess. But there's even though like the critiques are so incisive, like they're so sharp and just like devastating, the tone in which they're written is such that makes you think that there's a person on the other end of this who loves even the person that he's dismantling, which I find very interesting, right? Like he's not trying to be, arrogant or, evil or anything. Like he's trying to get things right instead of be right. And that's one of the reasons I was like, honestly, he's one of those guys where if I always like wonder like what the people who actually made some of the arguments that made it into his objection 1, objection 2, whatever, I will always wonder whether or not they were flattered to even be mentioned, like, because like in retrospect, at least, like he wasn't, like you said, he grew in popularity over time. But in retrospect, hey, if you made something that was as big of an argument that Aquinas even bothered to deal with it, I was like, I'll take that as a compliment. I hope to have a bad argument one day that's worth his attention.
Yeah. At least you said something new.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You're not just retreading old ground.
Okay. And that reminds me, it's one of those things that the closest I've ever got to that was I did a little bit of work with Alvin Plantinga back when I was writing my thesis, and so that is one of the things that, like, the nicest compliment I ever got from Plantinga was, that's not a completely stupid argument. So I'm like, oh,
Huh.
that's high praise. That's high
Yeah.
praise coming from Alvin. So like, I would love to be nuked by Aquinas one day. Maybe
Yeah.
when we're heaven.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it could be a lot of fun. Could be a lot of fun. Might
Yeah,
be harder when you're having a direct intellectual vision of God Himself, but
that's true. The beatific vision might make it so I can't make arguments anymore.
yeah,
Maybe he's writing one. Maybe he's just looking down and saying, "Oh, okay, I'm just noting all the ways that Tripp goes wrong." Be like, "Here's where you went wrong there." But yeah. All right. This was fun. I really enjoyed it. Stay tuned, everyone. If you're interested in these kind of topics, we will respond to the letter wiki of Sam, pretty soon, and then we'll go from there. We'll see how many more of these we do. There's a lot of
yeah.
topics to talk about, but this is fun for me. Thanks.
All right. Fun for me too. Thanks for having me on.
Yep.